I had been living what most would call a normal life, the kind where days blur into one another with predictable rhythms. For nearly 2 decades, I was married, tethered to a routine that felt safe, but increasingly hollow. It wasn't until recently that I realized I couldn't keep pretending. The marriage, once a source of comfort, had morphed into something suffocating, a cage I hadn't noticed until the bars pressed too close. I'd always known there was something different about me, a quiet truth buried beneath layers of denial, but it took years for it to surface fully. When it did, it hit me like a wave I couldn't outrun. I couldn't lie anymore, not to myself, not to her. So I packed a bag, just the essentials, and left. I didn't have a grand plan, only a destination, the home of my best friend. He'd been my anchor for years, the one I turned to when the world felt too heavy. We'd shared everything, late-night laughs over cheap beer, secrets whispered in the dark, moments of silence that said more than words ever could. Moving in with him wasn't just practical, it was inevitable. Over time, I started to see him differently. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the warmth of his presence, it stirred something in me I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I realized I loved him, and when that truth settled in, it didn't scare me. It felt right. We built a life together, one I hadn't dared to dream of before. Mornings became sacred, the two of us sipping coffee at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the window. We'd take walks in the park, the air crisp and the leaves crunching underfoot, our hands brushing occasionally as if by accident. Evenings were spent sprawled on the couch, the TV flickering with some show neither of us cared much about, just content to be near each other. For the first time in years, I felt free, not the reckless kind, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from knowing you're where you belong. This was my new beginning, a life I was crafting from scratch, and I was certain I'd finally found my happiness. Then came the phone call that shifted everything. My son, 19 and full of that restless energy young adults carry, reached out. He asked if he could stay with me for a while. I couldn't say no. I'd missed him more than I let myself admit since I'd walked away from the family. Guilt lingered in the corners of my mind, and I saw this as a chance to mend what I'd broken, or at least try. He showed up with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder, flashing a grin that reminded me of simpler times. At first, it was easy. He was polite, pitching in with chores like washing dishes or taking out the trash. He'd ask me questions about my life now, curious about how I'd ended up here, and I answered as honestly as I could. For a moment, I thought this might be an opportunity to bridge the gap between us, to show him who I really was and why I'd made the choices I had. But then I started to notice things. Little shifts in his demeanor that I couldn't quite pin down. The way he lingered a bit too long when he said goodnight, or how his questions grew sharper, more probing. It wasn't anything I could call out, not yet, just a flicker of unease that settled in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just adjusting to this new reality. Still, that vague sense of worry clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. That flicker of unease grew into something harder to ignore as the days went on. My son started acting in ways that threw me off balance. He'd step out of the shower with nothing but a towel slung low around his hips, water still clinging to his skin, and wander through the house for far longer than seemed necessary. He'd toss out casual excuses, forgot his robe, couldn't find a clean shirt, his tone light, almost playful. His movements had this effortless ease to them, too relaxed, like he wanted me to notice. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the carelessness of youth, the kind of thing I might have done at his age without a second thought. But it gnawed at me, the way he'd linger in doorways or stretch out on the couch, towel slipping just enough to make me look away. I wasn't the only one who saw it. My partner picked up on it too, his brow furrowing when my son was around. Late at night, when the house was quiet and we were tangled in the sheets, we'd whisper about it. I'd trace circles on his arm, trying to keep my voice steady as I wondered aloud if maybe this was just my son settling in, figuring out how to fit into this new dynamic. He'd nod, but I could feel the hesitation in the way he held himself, the way his breathing shifted. We agreed it was probably nothing, that we were overthinking it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a thread unraveling I couldn't quite grab hold of. The oddities didn't stop there. My son started steering our conversations into territory that made my stomach twist. Over dinner or while we were cleaning up, he'd ask about my past, pointed questions about how I'd figured out who I was when I'd first known I was drawn to men. His curiosity felt too sharp, like he was digging for something specific. Then came the offhand remarks, little jabs dressed up as jokes. He'd smirk and say he might be open to experimenting himself someday, his voice breezy but his eyes locked on mine a beat too long. There was something in that look I couldn't read, a glint that sent a shiver down my spine. I'd force a laugh, steering us back to safer ground, but the air felt heavier each time. I could sense the strain creeping into my relationship too. My partner grew quieter, his warmth pulling back like a tide. When my son was in the room, he'd find reasons to slip away, grabbing something from the kitchen, stepping outside for air. The easy intimacy we'd built started to fray at the edges, replaced by silences that stretched too long. He stopped sharing as much, his thoughts locked behind a wall I didn't know how to climb. I missed the way he'd rest his head on my shoulder, the way we'd talk about nothing and everything. Now, it felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for something I couldn't see. One night, it hit me harder. I was in the hallway, heading to grab a glass of water, when I caught sight of them in the living room. My son was leaning in close to my partner, laughing at some throwaway comment, his hand brushing my partner's shoulder in a way that felt too deliberate. From where I stood, half hidden by the dim light, I watched the scene unfold, a quick, casual touch, a shared chuckle, and a pang of jealousy stabbed through me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet ache that settled in my chest. I didn't say anything, didn't storm in or demand answers. I just turned back to the kitchen, gripping the counter until my knuckles whitened, telling myself I was imagining things. I didn't want to disrupt the fragile peace we'd carved out, didn't want to risk tipping us into chaos over what might be nothing. But each moment like that left a mark, a residue of doubt I couldn't wash away. Deep down, I started to wonder if my son's behavior wasn't as innocent as I'd convinced myself it was. That suspicion lingered like a splinter under my skin, but I never could have braced myself for what came next. It was a day like any other, except I wrapped up early and headed home sooner than usual, my footsteps light with the thought of surprising my partner with a quiet evening together. The house was still when I stepped inside, the kind of stillness that feels too thick, too deliberate. I set my keys down, the faint clink echoing in the silence, and that's when I heard it, soft, muffled sounds drifting from the bedroom. My chest tightened, a cold dread curling around my ribs. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the TV left on, but my feet moved anyway, drawn toward the noise like a moth to a flame. I reached the door, my hand hesitating on the knob for a split second before I turned it. The sight that greeted me stopped time itself. There they were, my son and my partner, locked together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The sheets were tangled around them, their bodies close, caught in a moment so intimate it felt like a blade twisting in my gut. They didn't see me at first, too wrapped up in each other, and I just stood there, frozen, watching as the world I'd built crumbled in front of me. My breath hitched, and then the tears came, hot and silent, spilling down my cheeks before I could stop them. I didn't scream or lunge forward, I couldn't. All I could do was stare, my heart shattering with every second that passed. When they finally noticed me, the room went dead quiet. My son's eyes widened, my partner's face drained of color, and for a moment, no one moved. My partner opened his mouth, his lips forming the start of something, an excuse, an apology, I'll never know, but I cut him off. My voice came out raw, louder than I intended, shaking with a fury and pain I didn't know I could feel. I told my son he'd destroyed everything, that he'd taken the one thing I had left, the last shred of hope I'd clung to. The words spilled out, jagged and messy, fueled by a betrayal so deep it choked me. Then I turned to my partner, my hand trembling as I pointed to the door, telling him to get out. It wasn't a request, it was a command, born from a place of rage and despair I couldn't control. He left without a sound, grabbing his things and slipping out like a shadow, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in my bones. I was alone with my son now, collapsing onto the couch, my face buried in my hands. The sobs came hard, wrenching up from somewhere deep, the kind of crying that leaves you hollowed out. My mind spun with memories, every morning coffee, every park walk, every night we'd spent building this life together. I'd thought it was stronger than the one I'd left behind, a chance to finally be whole. Now it was gone, reduced to ash in a single moment. My son stood there, watching me, his presence a weight I could feel even through my tears. I glanced up once, catching his eyes, calm, steady, no trace of guilt or anger, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I didn't know how to face this, how to pick up the pieces of a life that felt irreparable. All I knew was that I was lost, the ground beneath me gone, and I had no idea how to find my way back. A couple of days passed in a haze, each hour dragging me deeper into a fog I couldn't shake. I barely left the couch, my body heavy with the weight of what had happened, my mind replaying that moment in the bedroom over and over until it felt like a wound I couldn't stop picking at. Then my son came to me. I didn't want to face him, didn't want to see those calm eyes or hear his voice, but he didn't give me a choice. He sat down across from me, his posture steady, deliberate, like he'd planned every move. I braced myself, expecting excuses or tears, anything but what came next. He started talking, and his words hit me like a slow, cold tide. He told me it wasn't an accident. What I'd walked in on, what had torn my world apart, he'd meant for it to happen. His voice was even, almost clinical, as he explained that he wanted me to feel what betrayal tasted like, to know the sting of abandonment and the ache of being left behind. He brought up his mother, memories I tried to bury rising to the surface with every word. He said he remembered her crying after I left, her confusion as she tried to figure out what she'd done wrong, how she'd sat alone in a house that used to be ours. He'd watched her break, and now he wanted me to break too. It was payback, he said, a calculated move to make me understand the wreckage I'd left in my wake when I walked away from them. Each sentence landed like a stone, piling up until I could hardly breathe under the weight of it. But then he shifted, veering into something I never saw coming. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening, and admitted that it hadn't gone exactly as he'd planned. He said that despite his intentions, despite the anger that had driven him, he'd enjoyed it, the closeness, the moment with my partner. He didn't think of himself as gay, he was quick to add, but there was a spark in his eyes, a curiosity that hadn't been there before. He'd felt something, and it had woken up a part of him he didn't know existed. Then came the suggestion that stopped my heart cold. He wondered aloud if we could try something different, the three of us, me, him, and my partner, living together, finding a way to make it work. He painted it like it could be a fresh start, a strange kind of harmony where no one had to lose. His words hung in the air, absurd and impossible, yet delivered with a conviction that made my skin prickle. I sat there, staring at him, my mind a battlefield of emotions I couldn't sort out. Anger surged first, a hot rush at the idea that he'd orchestrated my pain and now dared to propose this. Shame followed, creeping in as I thought of my own choices, the hurt I'd caused that might have led us here. And beneath it all, a confusion so thick it choked me. What was he even asking for? Could he mean it? I didn't know what to feel, didn't know how to respond. He watched me for a moment longer, then stood and walked to his room, leaving me alone with his words echoing in my head. They looped endlessly, each one a question I couldn't answer, a thread I couldn't untangle. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady myself, but all I could hear was the sound of his voice, calm and certain, offering a future I couldn't begin to imagine. Those words stayed with me, sinking deeper into my mind as the days dragged on. I couldn't let go of what my son had done, couldn't forgive the way he turned my life inside out with such cold precision. Yet his reasoning, that calculated confession about revenge, struck a nerve I couldn't ignore. It dragged me back to memories of my wife, moments I'd pushed down for years. I saw her face again, the way it crumpled during our last talks, her voice breaking as she asked what had gone wrong. Her tears haunted me now, glistening in the dim light of our old kitchen, and I wondered if maybe this was my reckoning. Maybe I'd earned this pain, this unraveling, for the hurt I'd left behind when I chose myself over them. My thoughts kept circling back to my partner too, the man I'd sent away in a fit of rage. I could still see him standing there, stunned and silent, before he walked out the door. Part of me ached to pick up the phone, to hear his voice, to beg him to come back and stitch up the pieces of what we'd had. But another part hesitated, heavy with doubt. Could I ever trust him again after what I'd seen? The image of him with my son burned behind my eyes, a wound too fresh to touch, and I wasn't sure if love could outlast that kind of betrayal. I missed him, his quiet laugh, the way he'd steady me without a word, but the thought of reaching out felt like stepping off a cliff with no bottom in sight. And then there was my son's suggestion, that wild, unthinkable idea of the three of us together. It was madness, a fever dream I should have dismissed outright. Yet it clung to me, sneaking into my thoughts when I least expected it. I'd catch myself picturing it, how it might look, the three of us under one roof, navigating something so strange and uncharted. The idea repulsed me, a visceral twist in my gut at the sheer wrongness of it. But there was something else too, a flicker of curiosity I hated myself for feeling, a pull toward the unknown that I couldn't fully shake. It left me dizzy, caught between disgust and a nagging what-if that wouldn't let me rest. I drifted through the house like a ghost, my footsteps hollow against the floor. I couldn't settle anywhere, every room felt too small, too full of echoes. Sometimes I'd glance at my son, moving through his day as if nothing had shifted, his casual ease stoking a quiet fury in me. He'd hum while making breakfast or sprawl on the couch with his phone, untouched by the chaos he'd unleashed, and it made my hands clench into fists. At night, sleep refused to come. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, my mind a storm of every choice, every moment that had led me here. I traced the cracks in my decisions, searching for the spot where I'd gone wrong, but the answers slipped through my fingers. Just weeks ago, my life had felt clear, a path I'd chosen with certainty. Now it was a tangled mess, a knot so tight I didn't know where to start pulling. I was adrift, torn between anger and longing, guilt and fear, with no clue how to find solid ground again. I'm standing at a crossroads now, and I don't know which way to turn. My mind keeps spinning, pulling me in every direction at once, but none of them feel right. I think about my son, about whether I could ever forgive him, whether I could sit across from him and try to unravel why he did what he did. His motives cut me deep, but they also echo with a truth I can't ignore, and I wonder if understanding him might somehow ease this ache. Then there's my partner, the man I pushed out the door in a moment of fury. I imagine picking up the phone, hearing his voice again, asking him to come back even after the sting of his betrayal. It's a risk that terrifies me. Could we rebuild what's broken, or would I just be inviting more hurt? And that other path, the one my son laid out, looms like a shadow I can't shake. Taking that step into something so bizarre, so unknown, it's equal parts horrifying and strangely magnetic, a pull I don't want to admit I feel. I'm lost in it all, crushed under the weight of my own confusion. Loneliness wraps around me like a second skin, pressing in until I can barely breathe. Every choice feels wrong, a dead end dressed up as a solution, but staying stuck here, suspended in this mess, isn't something I can bear much longer. I need to move, to decide, but I'm paralyzed, staring down roads that all lead into fog. So I'm turning to anyone who'll listen, anyone who might read this and see something I can't. What would you do if you were me? How do you find a way out when everything you held close is slipping through your fingers? I'm reaching for anything, advice, a fresh perspective, even just a handful of words that might light the way forward. I don't know how to keep going, but I'm desperate to figure it out, and I'm hoping someone out there can help me see what I'm missing.